Hello, welcome to this video lecture on Chapter 6, Analyzing the Current Database. To me, this is more about requirements analysis, and so if you ever go on and take a systems analysis and design course, that's maybe what you'll see. So a lot of what you'll get in this chapter is exactly what you'll see in that requirements analysis phase of systems analysis and design. So the topics we're going to cover, and you should come back and ask yourself what it is that we are talking about when we say getting to know the current database and why that's important. We'll conduct the analysis. We'll look at how data is collected, where do you get it from, how the information is presented, and then look at a list of subjects and fields. And the subjects are going to become our tables in our database. So what we're doing here is actually looking at how the business uses data in their processing. And is there a way that we can improve on that process by using our database? Or are we just capturing exactly what they're doing now and just replicating that in the database to automate the process somehow? So let's go ahead and get started. So the first item here is getting to know your current database. And so before you can make things better, you need to understand how are you currently doing things. One thing your book emphasized was do not adopt the current database structure as the basis for your new database structure. And the reason is probably very simple is that, you wouldn't be redoing the database if there weren't problems that you wanted to avoid. And so if you're using the existing database, you're just going to replicate those same problems in the new database structure. So some examples of those kind of problems would be your awkward table structures, poorly defined relationships, and inconsistent field specifications. Now, inconsistent field specifications mean you're using the same name in different tables, not the same name. You're using the same data with the same characteristics with different names in different tables. And so then when you're trying to match things up, it becomes difficult to do so. And we'll have some more examples of that later on. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't use the existing database. So the existing database is a good resource that you can use to see where you're currently at, what you're currently doing. And hopefully as you go through that analysis, you can figure out which parts of that database you want to get rid of or discard. So you need to have a clear understanding of your organization's database so that you can determine whether that database supports the organization's current information requirements. So keep in mind that's the reason why you're designing a new database. Also keep in mind that when this book talks about your current database, they may also be referring to your paper version of record keeping or databases. That is what I like to call the manual system. So when they say, have a clear understanding of that current database, they may be also talking about the manual system. You do it manually this way. And so how are you going to then convert that over into a database structure? And so that's what we're talking about here in terms of that organization's current information requirements. Now, as you're looking through that and you're thinking about the process that they're going through, then you want to try and say, is there a better way to do that? So you may uncover some existing structural deficiencies, things that could be improved upon that would help improve that business process. And so that also relates to this last item here, and that is determine how that database needs to evolve so that it can support the organization in the future. So as you're asking your questions, you need to be asking, what are your intentions long term? How should this thing be designed so that it can handle additional growth without making lots of changes to the structure? Because a lot of times when that's not taken into account, and then all of a sudden the company needs to add certain other pieces of information, other datas, other tables, then when they add that in and start doing the relationships, it becomes very difficult to get the information that they want back out, and it may be time to redesign that database, which can be a very long process. In a traditional systems analysis and design, it may take 6 months to a year or even more just to get the analysis done before you can ever start designing the database. So some different categories that you may run into for this database is the paper-based database, which I alluded to earlier, and I consider that the manual way of doing it. And this might contain different forms and handwritten or printed documents stored in file folders or bound in notebooks. I like to think of this as when you go to a doctor's office and you're filling out that paperwork there. Are they entering that into a database, or does it just go into a file somewhere that they can go and manually look up? And if you look in some older doctor's offices, you'll see these big, huge folders, and those are patient information, and so those are the manual paper-based databases. You can also have something called a legacy database. These are databases that are in existence for several years or more, and they have different types of data structures and different ways of interfacing with that database. So there's a user interface that when it comes up on a computer, the user then enters that data or can retrieve that data through that interface. For us, I think in this week's homework, we have some forms that you can look at, and we've done a form before. In a relational database system, it's that form where you're entering data, that's the interface that most users will interact with to get data in and out of the table structures. The last type of database that you might run into is what your book refers to as human knowledge bases. And these are based on the memory of one or more employees that you have within the organization. It's probably very unstructured, and sometimes when you have somebody that has a lot of information like this, you want to try and capture that before they leave the organization so that you don't have an organizational brain drain or organizational knowledge that's leaving. The goals of this analysis that you're doing is you want to find out what types of data the organization uses, how they manage and maintain that data, and then determine how the organization views and uses the data that's in that database, especially the one you're going to create. Just keep in mind from what I've said before is the output for the reports that are going to be coming from this database help you determine what data needs to go into the database. And you'll find this information out from your analysis and interviews that you've done with all the employees that are going to be interacting with this database, and also the management side that's going to be interacting with this database. So once you have this, then that's going to help you determine the tables that you need to produce and the fields that go in each of those tables, and then your overall database structure of how the tables are linked up to each other. So if we look at each of the categories of those different types of databases that the organization might be using, we'll look at this paper-based one first. So this one incorporates data that is literally collected, stored, and manipulated on paper. And so it depends on what kind of forms are they using, where are they storing it, is it stored in one location, and so on. And so you've got to be able to look at that process and say, okay, here's what they're collecting, what's the process they go through in order to use that data. And if they're not using it, you need to be asking, why are they collecting it? And so you may have to interview many different people to get an overall good view of that process the organization is using. So it's difficult to find someone who completely understands how that paper-based database works. And so once you can find those people, then you can learn its use and the purpose. And that's what you want to transfer into your relational database management system, something like Access or some other kind of relational database. So there are some problems with paper-based databases that you need to understand so that you don't transfer that into the actual computerized database. The problems then with paper-based databases are that you could have inconsistent data. You might have data that's being collected on multiple forms, the same type of data. Are you getting the same information there, which leads to erroneous data? Might be duplicated data, redundant data that you don't need to copy twice. You might have paper forms that you have incomplete entries on. What do you do then? And then if you have old data, when should it be purged? And so those are all things that you need to not try and duplicate in your new database. But having this paper database allows you to extract the individual pieces of data from the different forms or documents or reports or anything else that's being used for that paper-based database, and then transform those into your tables and fields for your new database. And so one thing you will probably see a lot of is a request for changes, additions, and deletions from this paper to electronic due to that limited ability to change what's on the paper documents. And keep in mind that change, additions, and deletions, when you're inputting data into a database, your form should have buttons on it that allow you to do these operations. So you want to be able to change or edit a record, add a record, or delete a record. But you got to make sure that you're doing that properly and not accidentally doing those things. So the second category of databases that you'll run into is this legacy database. And typically, according to your book, the databases that have been in existence or used for 5 years or more. And so they're old databases. And, I remember getting into PCs in the 80s, and prior to that, the legacy databases were running on old mainframes or mini computers. And so those are databases that the company uses but doesn't want to spend the time or resources to transfer them over usually. So, whatever they're doing, it's working for them, but then it gets to a point that, okay, now we've got to convert our legacy database over to the new system. And so those are the older databases that the company has been using for 5 years or more. And so what happens during that time frame? People move on, people get promoted, people leave the company. And these are the people that had some kind of involvement in the development of that legacy database. And so if you look at this statement here, there's typically not going to be any single individual completely understands that database structure or how it was implemented into the relational database management system. And so just keep in mind, Access is a relational database management system. I'm sure that the database that we developed for the health center here on campus probably 10 years ago, even if it's still available, nobody would know how to use it or how to make modifications to it without affecting, some other process that it's currently been used or hooked up a certain way. So some problems with legacy databases include what we just talked about, a lack of a knowledgeable administrator. There's probably duplicated fields, that is data that is used the same throughout the system that resides in multiple tables. There's also redundant data, that is records that contain the same information but it's slightly different. So it might be like when you're keeping track of somebody's address and they move, you just enter another record with that same person in there, but you don't delete the old record. So there's redundant data in there that should be removed. And so that leads to performance inefficiencies when you have that kind of data, not only how the database runs from a computer standpoint, but also from a business performance issue in terms of, are you sending out, email or regular mail to the correct people, or is it going to their old addresses, and how much of that is really old and you're wasting all that postage and time and effort to send it out to an address that doesn't exist or isn't really your customer anymore. And if you're taking notes, the stuff we just talked about probably should go here. All right, so this is running past my typical 15 minutes. And so when I come back, we're going to stop this, and when we come back, we'll do part 2.